The phone lit up on the nightstand while he was still in the shower. A message preview flashed across the lock screen, bright against the dark wood surface. I miss waking up next to you. Not a name attached to it. Just a red heart emoji where the contact name should have been. My stomach dropped before my brain could fully process what I was seeing. I was sitting on the edge of our bed, folding laundry from the basket at my feet, sorting Troy's work shirts from my own clothes. The phone buzzed again, another message coming through. Can't wait for tomorrow night. I stared at the screen, my hands frozen mid-fold on one of his button-downs. The shower was still running in the attached bathroom, water pounding against tile, steam creeping out from under the door. Troy's voice carried over the sound, humming something off-key and cheerful. He had no idea I could see his phone. No idea those messages had just appeared. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat feeling too loud, too fast. The shower kept running, the familiar sound of water hitting tile that I'd heard every morning for 3 years. Steam continued filling the bathroom like nothing was wrong, like this was just another ordinary Tuesday evening. Troy's humming stopped briefly, probably as he shampooed his hair, then started again. Some song from the radio he'd had stuck in his head all week. My hands were already shaking when I picked up the phone from the nightstand. I knew his passcode. We'd shared them 2 years ago, right after we got engaged, in what I'd thought was a gesture of trust and transparency. He knew mine too, or at least he had. I changed it 3 months ago during a random security update and never mentioned it. Now I was glad I had. The phone unlocked easily under my trembling thumb. I glanced at the bathroom door, still closed, steam still seeping out. The shower would run at least another 5 minutes. Troy was methodical about his routine. Had time. The message thread opened under my touch, and my world tilted sideways. Photos filled the screen as I scrolled up, images I'd never seen before. Troy and a woman I didn't recognize. Her face pressed against his in a dozen different selfies. Inside jokes in the messages, references to places and experiences I knew nothing about. Plans for tomorrow night detailed and specific. Friday night. The night Troy had told me was his monthly guys' night with his college friends. The night I'd never questioned because I trusted him, because I had my own standing dinner with my sister every third Friday. This wasn't flirting. This wasn't some inappropriate texting that had gotten out of hand. This was a complete second life, fully formed and running parallel to ours. The messages went back months, maybe longer. I stopped scrolling, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The shower was still running. Troy was still humming. And I was holding evidence that everything I'd believed about my relationship was a carefully constructed lie. My name is Mara Ellison. I'm 31 years old. A white American woman who'd believed she was 6 months away from marrying the love of her life. I'm a graphic designer who works from home 3 days a week, which means I'm usually here when Troy leaves for his job as a commercial insurance broker. I'm the woman who packs his lunch most mornings, who schedules our social calendar, who's been planning a wedding for next April with a guest list of 200 people. I'm the woman who just discovered that the man humming in the shower 10 feet away has been lying to me for over a year. The message timestamps went back at least 14 months, based on what I could see in those 30 seconds of scrolling. 14 months of another woman. 14 months of secret messages and hidden meetups. 14 months while I'd been tasting wedding cakes and addressing save-the-date cards and building a future with someone who was already living a different life entirely. The bathroom door handle turned, and I locked the phone instantly, my movements automatic despite my shaking hands. I placed the phone back on the nightstand exactly where it had been, screen down, charging cable still attached. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I forced my hands to steady as I picked up another shirt from the laundry basket. Troy stepped out of the bathroom, relaxed and clean, a towel wrapped around his waist. Water droplets still clung to his shoulders. His dark hair was wet and pushed back from his face. He smiled at me, that familiar easy smile I'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. "Hey babe," he said, walking toward the closet. "Kiss." He detoured to where I sat on the bed, leaning down expectantly. I gave him one, pressing my lips to his briefly, pulling back before he could notice anything wrong. He never noticed how cold my lips were, how stiff my shoulders had gone. He just smiled again and headed to the closet to find clothes for tomorrow, talking about his day at work, some client who'd been difficult, a meeting that had run long. I made appropriate sounds, nodding in the right places, my hands still mechanically folding laundry while my mind raced ahead. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw his phone at him or demand explanations or create a scene that would force an immediate confrontation. I sat on the bed and folded the rest of the laundry while Troy got dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, while he talked about being hungry and asked what I wanted for dinner. My voice sounded remarkably normal when I suggested ordering from the Thai place we both liked. He agreed enthusiastically, already pulling up the delivery app on his phone, the same phone that held evidence of his betrayal. I watched him scroll through menu options. His face illuminated by the screen, completely relaxed, completely unaware. The control I felt was strange, almost foreign. Every instinct screamed to confront him immediately, to demand the truth, to make him explain those messages. But something deeper and colder held me back. Anger would fade. Tears would dry. Information was permanent. Evidence was power. And I needed both before I made any moves. So I ordered pad thai and spring rolls and let Troy pick a movie on Netflix like this was any other Tuesday night. We ate dinner on the couch, Troy's arm around my shoulders, some action movie playing on the TV that I didn't process at all. He made jokes about the bad dialogue. I laughed at the right moments. He kissed my temple during a slow scene, and I leaned into him like always. The performance was easier than I'd expected, maybe because I'd been performing without knowing it for 14 months already. Performing the role of trusting fiancé while Troy lived a double life. When the movie ended, he suggested we go to bed early. He had an early meeting tomorrow, he said. I agreed, following him to the bedroom, brushing my teeth beside him at the bathroom sink, changing into pajamas while he set his alarm. We got into bed together, and he pulled me close, his breathing evening out within minutes as he fell asleep. I lay awake in the dark, his arm heavy across my waist, and thought about the first time I'd asked about his late nights 6 months ago. How he'd laughed, called me dramatic, said trust meant not asking questions. I'd apologized for being concerned. That conversation replayed in my mind while Troy slept beside me, his breathing deep and steady. Had been November, right before Thanksgiving. He'd been staying late at the office 3 nights a week, coming home after 9 each time. I'd mentioned feeling like we barely saw each other anymore. He'd turned it around so smoothly I hadn't even noticed the manipulation until now. You don't trust me? He'd asked, his voice hurt and confused. I'm working hard for our future, for the wedding, for the house we want to buy. And you're questioning me. I'd backtracked immediately, feeling guilty for even bringing it up. No, of course I trust you. Sorry. I just miss you. He'd accepted my apology, kissed my forehead, and promised to try to be home earlier. The late nights had continued. I'd stopped mentioning them. That was the moment I should have paid attention, I realized now. The moment he'd weaponized my concern and turned it into my fault. Classic deflection. Classic gaslighting. And I'd fallen for it completely. The pattern became obvious once I started looking for it, like one of those optical illusions that snaps into focus once you know what you're seeing. The work trips that seemed to happen every 6 weeks like clockwork. The sudden passwords on his phone and laptop that appeared about a year ago, around the same time those messages started. The way he accused me of being paranoid whenever I felt uneasy about anything. You're being insecure again, he'd say, making it about my feelings rather than his actions. You know I love you. Why do you always need reassurance? And I'd accepted that framing, believing the problem was my insecurity rather than his deception. I lay in the dark, listening to Troy sleep, and catalogued every red flag I'd ignored. Every time he'd picked fights right before a trip, making me feel like I was being unreasonable. Every time he'd stayed glued to his phone during dinner, claiming it was work. Every time my gut had whispered something was wrong and I'd silenced it because I trusted him more than I trusted myself. I made a choice in those dark hours before dawn. I wouldn't confront Troy. Not yet. Not until I had complete information, full documentation, and a solid plan for what came next. Because anger was temporary. It flared hot and bright and could be soothed with apologies and promises. Information didn't fade. Evidence couldn't be explained away or minimized. I needed to know everything before I revealed that I knew anything. So I would observe. I would document. I would gather every piece of proof I needed while Troy continued believing his secret was safe. The decision settled something inside me, transforming the hurt and shock into cold, focused determination. I wouldn't be the emotional, irrational woman he'd always implied I was when I questioned him. I'd be methodical, careful, strategic. By the time Troy knew I'd discovered his lies, it would be too late for him to minimize the damage or control the narrative. I fell asleep sometime after 4, Troy's arm still around me, my mind already planning the next steps. Over the next week I learned everything. Her name was Simone Kaufman, and she was 28, 3 years younger than me. She worked in marketing at a company 2 blocks from Troy's office. They'd met at a networking event 18 months ago, according to messages I found buried in the thread. Their routine was meticulous. Friday nights were theirs always, which explained why Troy had been so insistent about maintaining guys' night every month without fail. Tuesday lunches when they could both get away from their offices. Occasional weekend afternoons when Troy claimed he was playing basketball with his brother, who lived 2 hours away and whom I never called to verify. They had inside jokes about co-workers I'd never heard of. They'd taken a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast 3 months ago during one of Troy's supposed work conferences. I found photos of them together that made my stomach turn. How carefully Troy had kept us separated, managing his double life with precision. I was never meant to find out. He'd been confident he could maintain this indefinitely. I played my role perfectly all week. I made dinner every night, asked about his day at work, discussed wedding plans during breakfast on Saturday morning. We met with our florist to finalize centerpiece options. We had lunch with Troy's parents on Sunday, and I smiled through their questions about honeymoon destinations. Troy relaxed more each day, his shoulders loosening, his guard dropping. He laughed easier, joked more, seemed genuinely happy. That was his mistake. His comfort made him sloppy. He left his phone unattended while he showered. He forgot to close message threads before setting it down. He stopped being quite so careful about angles when he was texting, assuming I wasn't looking. I was always looking now. Every casual glance gathered information. Every moment alone with his phone or laptop added to the file I was building. I set up a cloud folder he didn't know about, uploading screenshots and photos, documenting dates and times. Building a case like I was preparing for trial. Because in a way I was. The evidence accumulated quickly once I knew where to look. Screenshots of messages where Simone called him by pet names I'd thought were ours exclusively. Photos from dates I could match to nights Troy had claimed he was working late. Calendar entries on his phone for dentist appointments and car maintenance that lined up perfectly with long, affectionate message threads. I copied everything methodically, my hand steady now, my shock hardening into something colder. Every lie he'd told built the file thicker. Every deception added weight to the evidence. I found a shared photo album they'd created together, full of selfies and screenshots of their conversations. Pictures of Simone wearing a necklace I'd never seen, Troy's arm around her in restaurants I'd suggested we try and he'd always said weren't his style. The careful documentation of their relationship, preserved digitally, now preserved in my secret folder. Troy had no idea he'd left such a perfect trail. He'd been confident enough in his deception that he hadn't bothered to truly hide it, just hidden it from me. I thought about how I'd supported Troy when his career stalled 2 years ago. He'd been passed over for a promotion he'd been certain he'd get, and the rejection had sent him into a depression that lasted months. I'd covered more than my share of bills without complaint, encouraging him, building him back up, believing we were partners facing challenges together. I'd stayed positive when he'd wanted to quit his job entirely, when he'd talked about career changes that would have meant starting over financially. I'd supported his decision to stay and prove himself, celebrated when he'd finally gotten the promotion 6 months later. How easy it had been for him to betray someone who'd made his life comfortable and stable. Someone who'd believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. The irony was bitter. I'd been his foundation while he'd built a secret life on top of it. Used my support as a platform to pursue someone else. Taken my trust for granted while lying to my face every single day. Troy started slipping more noticeably in the second week of my silent investigation. He left his phone on the kitchen counter while he took out the trash, screen unlocked. A message from Simone visible. He stopped deleting message threads every night, maybe because weeks had passed since I'd seen that first notification and he felt safe. Confidence made people careless. I'd read that somewhere, maybe in a psychology article or a crime novel. Now I was watching it happen in real time. Troy's arrogance about his ability to deceive me was creating gaps in his usual caution. He'd gotten away with it for so long that he'd stopped believing he might get caught. That false security gave me opportunities one exploited ruthlessly. I'd wait until he was in the shower or taking out the garbage or running into the gas station, and I'd quickly photograph whatever was on his screen. His laptop passwords were saved in his browser. His email was full of hotel confirmations and restaurant reservations for 2. Everything I needed was right there, protected only by his assumption that I'd never look. I found the shared credit card account he'd been using for hotels on a Wednesday afternoon while Troy was at work. I was looking through our joint financial accounts, something I did monthly to track our budget and savings, when I noticed a card I didn't recognize on his credit report. I checked our reports together last month as part of our mortgage pre-approval process for the house we planned to buy after the wedding. This card hadn't been there then, which meant it was new. I logged into the account using Troy's standard password, the one he used for everything financial. The statements loaded and my stomach dropped. My name was on the account as an authorized user, added without my knowledge or consent. But every charge was his. Hotels in the city, always charged on Friday afternoons. Romantic restaurants I'd wanted to try but he'd said were too expensive. Florist. A jewelry store, a purchase made 3 months ago for $700. I'd never received jewelry from Troy in the past year. Simone had, apparently. He'd put me on the account to build credit or reduce his debt-to-income ratio, using me to facilitate his affair. I waited after discovering the credit card, letting days pass while I gathered more information and planned my next steps. Because revenge wasn't loud or immediate. Revenge was patient and calculated. Real revenge meant ensuring Troy would feel every consequence of his choices, not just immediate anger but lasting repercussions he couldn't talk his way out of. I wanted him to feel safe first. Wanted him to believe he'd successfully maintained his double life, that he was skilled enough to keep juggling both relationships indefinitely. The more secure he felt, the harder the fall would be. So I smiled and planned wedding details and made dinner and played the role of loving fiancé. Meanwhile, I was systematically dismantling the life he thought was secure. Every day Troy remained unaware was another day I used to protect myself, to build my case, to prepare for the moment when everything would collapse around him. Patience was power. And I'd learned patience from watching him lie to me for 18 months. I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney on Thursday morning, using my lunch break to drive to an office across town where I wouldn't risk running into anyone who knew Troy. The attorney's name was Patricia Vance, and she specialized in high-conflict separations and asset protection. I told her everything. The messages, photos, the shared credit card with my name on it, the timeline of lies. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "You're not married yet," she said when I finished. "That makes things simpler in some ways, more complex in others. Do you own property together?" I shook my head. "We rent. Both our names are on the lease, but it's month to month. We have a joint checking account for household expenses." She made more notes. You'll want to remove yourself from that account and the credit card. I can provide documentation if he challenges the removal. And you'll want to compile every piece of evidence you have. I told her about the folder I'd created. She smiled, the expression sharp and satisfied. Good. You're thinking ahead. That's going to protect you. Troy told me he was working late on Friday, the same Friday I knew was his standing date night with Simone. Big presentation to finish, he said over breakfast. His voice apologetic. I'll probably be at the office until 9 or 10. Don't wait up for dinner. I told him I understood, that I'd probably use the time to catch up on some design work for a client. He kissed me goodbye at the door, his laptop bag over his shoulder, and I watched through the window as he backed out of the driveway. Then I opened the location tracking app we shared, the one we'd set up 2 years ago for safety and convenience. Troy's phone showed him driving toward his office, the blue dot moving along the familiar route. I watched it for 30 minutes while I made myself coffee and responded to actual client emails. At 10:30, the blue dot changed direction. It drove across town, away from Troy's office, and stopped at an address I'd already looked up. Simone's apartment complex. I made dinner anyway. Chicken and vegetables, Troy's favorite meal. Set the table for 2. And waited. That night, while Troy was at Simone's apartment and thought I believed he was working late, I moved money. Not illegally. Not in any way that would create problems later. Just precisely and carefully, following the steps Patricia Vance had outlined during our consultation. I transferred my half of our joint savings account into a new individual account at a different bank. I removed myself as an authorized user from the credit card Troy had added me to without permission. I documented every shared expense from the past 6 months, creating a spreadsheet that showed exactly what I'd contributed versus what he had. I changed the passwords on all my personal accounts, my email, my cloud storage, my freelance client portals. Everything that was mine became inaccessible to him. By the time Troy came home at 10:15, smiling and relaxed and smelling like perfume that wasn't mine, I had protected myself financially. He found me reading on the couch, the dinner I'd made still in containers on the counter. You didn't eat, he asked. I shook my head. Waited for you. He seemed touched, actually touched, by what he thought was devotion. Had no idea it was strategy. The divorce papers arrived at Troy's office on a Monday morning 3 weeks after I'd first seen those messages on his phone. I'd spent those weeks gathering evidence, consulting with Patricia, protecting my assets, and playing the perfect fiancé. Troy had spent them relaxing into his double life, confident he'd managed everything successfully. The process server found him at work, handing over the envelope in front of his coworkers, in front of his boss. Official and public and impossible to ignore. I know because Patricia called me at 11 to confirm service had been completed. Troy called me 10 times in the next hour. I let every call go to voicemail. Each message was more frantic than the last. His voice rising from confused to panicked to desperate. Mara, what is this? Call me back. We need to talk about this. This is insane. Please pick up. I didn't pick up. I was at a coffee shop across town, meeting with a realtor about studio apartments I could afford on my income alone. My phone buzzed with Troy's calls, and I silenced it without looking. Troy came home that evening frantic and disheveled. His tie loosened. His usually neat hair pushed back like he'd been running his hands through it. I was in the bedroom, packing my clothes into suitcases I'd bought that afternoon. He stopped in the doorway, staring. Mara. His voice cracked on my name. What are you doing? What is happening? I continued folding a sweater, placing it carefully in the suitcase. I'm leaving. Because of some paperwork. He stepped into the room, his hands out like he was approaching a scared animal. We can talk about this. Whatever you're upset about, we can fix it. I turned to face him fully. I know about Simone. The color drained from his face. I know about the messages, the hotels, the credit card you put in my name, the 18 months of lies. I know everything. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. It was a mistake. Just a stupid mistake. I'll end it. She means nothing. No, I said calmly. You don't get to minimize this. You don't get to call 18 months a mistake. He was begging now. Troy's affair partner disappeared within days of my filing for dissolution of our engagement and financial separation. Simone had believed Troy was single, or at least that's what she claimed when she called me crying 2 days after the papers were served. Troy had told her he wasn't in a relationship, that he'd broken up with his long-term girlfriend over a year ago. She'd seen the engagement ring, but he'd explained it away somehow, claiming it was complicated, that he couldn't talk about it. She'd believed him because she'd wanted to, because the lies were easier than the truth. When she learned about me, about the wedding planned for April, about the life Troy had been maintaining while dating her, she'd ended it immediately. The job promotion Troy had been bragging about for weeks vanished with the scandal. His supervisor had questions about the public scene with the process server, about the rumors circulating around the office. Professional reputation mattered in Troy's industry, and public drama was a liability. Everything he'd been carefully balancing crashed at once. The relationship with Simone he'd thought was secure. The engagement to me he'd assumed would continue. The career advancement he'd been counting on. All of it collapsed because he'd believed he was clever enough to maintain it all indefinitely. 3 weeks after I'd moved out into a small studio apartment downtown, Troy asked if there was any way back to what we'd had. He sent the message via email since I'd blocked his number. His words careful and formal. He'd been going to therapy, he claimed. He understood what he'd done wrong. He wanted a chance to prove he could change, to rebuild my trust, to fix what he'd broken. I read the email twice, sitting on my new couch in my new apartment, surrounded by boxes I was still unpacking. Then I replied with a single word. No. I didn't elaborate. Didn't explain my reasoning or provide closure or give him the opportunity to argue. Just no. Simple, final, absolute. It was the first completely honest word he'd heard from me in months. Everything else had been performance, strategy, careful management of his assumptions while I protected myself. But that no was real. It carried the weight of every lie he'd told, every moment of betrayal, every time he'd made me question my own instincts. He responded 3 more times over the next week, each email longer and more desperate. I didn't reply to any of them. Eventually they stopped. I walked away from my engagement with my finances intact, my dignity untouched, and my future wide open in a way it hadn't been for years. The studio apartment was smaller than the house Troy and I had been planning to buy, but it was entirely mine. Decorated how I wanted, organized around my schedule, free from lies and secrets and the constant low-level anxiety I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Troy stayed behind with his excuses and regrets and the empty apartment we'd shared, the lease I'd removed myself from with proper notice and documentation. I heard through mutual friends that he'd tried to date again, but his reputation in our social circle was destroyed. People knew what he'd done, how long he'd lied, how elaborate the deception had been. 6 months after I left, I landed my biggest freelance client yet, a campaign that paid more than I'd made in the previous year. I signed the contract in my apartment, alone, and felt nothing but satisfaction. I didn't look back, didn't wonder if I'd made the right choice, didn't question whether I should have tried to forgive him. Because I hadn't lost a fiancé. I'd reclaimed myself from a relationship built on lies. And that was worth everything.